I think we're just now at 5:30. I will continue to let people in as they come in, if they're running a little bit late. But Representative James, if you want to get us started, that'd be fabulous.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us. It's great to see a bunch of people here joining us on the Zoom. And we are also live streaming this event and taping it for folks to watch later. So special thanks to Attorney General Clark and Treasurer Pieciak for joining us tonight. And my only official role is to introduce them. So I'm just going to read a few bio snippets so folks understand who these fantastic statewide elected officials are. So Charity Clark was sworn in as Attorney General of Vermont on January 5th, 2023. She is the first woman to be elected to this position. Since then, she has made protecting Vermonters her top priority, suing Monsanto for PCB contamination of Vermont's waterways and schools, and bringing a case against Meta for Instagram's harm to young users' mental health. As Attorney General, she has also continued her career-long focus on reproductive rights and sexual and domestic violence. Charity joined the AG's office in 2014 as an Assistant Attorney General in the Public Protection Division. She was born and raised in Southern Vermont and grew up working in her family's grocery store in Londonderry. She is a graduate of Burton in Manchester, UVM, and Boston College Law School. Treasurer Mike Pieciak was inaugurated as Vermont's 31st state treasurer in January 2023, and as treasurer, he is focused on economic and financial equity. Mike successfully led the passage of Vermont Saves. That's a new public retirement program for 80,000 plus Vermonters who currently lack access to a retirement plan through their employer. And he also expanded the 10% in Vermont program, making the development of new housing a top priority. Through this program, in September 23, his office announced $55 million in low-interest housing loans that's going to leverage $340 million more to build more than 1,000 new housing units in Vermont. Mike was previously commissioner of the Department of Financial Regulation. He grew up in Brattleboro, graduated from Union College with a degree in poli-sci, and received his law degree from University of Miami Law School. And Mike lives in Winooski with his partner, Will. So with that, welcome everybody, and I will turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the introductions. And Attorney General Clark, I would think we probably would be best starting off if you could maybe give us a little bit of a rundown on what work your office has been doing.
Yeah, sure. I want to begin by saying thank you to everybody for being here tonight. I know that this has been an unnerving time for some, a demoralizing time for some, an exhilarating time for others. And I'm really pleased to be here tonight to be a part of the conversation and also tell you about what my office does. I will also, as you heard Representative James say, I'm from Manchester, so this is particularly thrilling to me because when I say in my speeches that, Vermont is the place that raised me, I'm speaking specifically of Manchester. And this is just like a really fun night for me for that reason. So I want to acknowledge that Donald Trump won the presidential race in November, and Americans wanted to see his vision put in place. And we can all recognize that and respect that. However, when voters voted for Donald Trump, they couldn't vote to violate the Constitution or federal law, nor, in my opinion, did they want that to happen. I am very fortunate in my office. I have been given the power, the authority, and the responsibility to sue Donald Trump and his administration when they violate federal laws or the Constitution of the United States. In fact, I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States when I was sworn in. And it's an honor to represent Vermont in this way. And I want to assure you that we are taking all of the actions very seriously, including the executive orders and others that the Trump administration is taking. We're analyzing each one along with our fellow state attorneys general across the country to make sure that the Trump administration is not violating federal law or the Constitution. We have so far sued 7 times. So one per week. We'll see how this week goes. It's early still. The first one was this was like the first day of Donald Trump's tenure as presidency. We sued the federal government over the birthright citizenship ban. Birthright citizenship is something granted to all of us in the Constitution, and it is very well settled law that it is, a part of our Constitution that we have a right to. We were really proud to be able to bring this lawsuit. Ultimately, a judge granted what's called a temporary restraining order, and we're going to be talking about that a lot when we talk about our lawsuit. So I'll just describe a temporary restraining order is truly temporary. It's usually only in place for a few days, and then a preliminary injunction is the next stop on our efforts. But what it basically means is we blocked the Trump administration from being able to put their executive order into place regarding birthright citizenship. That one in particular the case was overseen by, well, there's a couple of cases going, but the one that blocked the order from going into effect was a Reagan appointed judge. For those of us who remember Ronald Reagan, he was a Republican who was very conservative and of course revered. He had 2 terms. And that judge said this was the most unconstitutional thing he'd ever seen in 40 years on the federal bench. So not a great start to our adventures with the Trump administration. And this a few days later, we had to start working on a second lawsuit, and that involved what was called the OMB memo. The OMB memo, the Office of Budget and Management and Budget, was a memo that put in place a federal funding freeze to grants. And we had to once again get involved, and we sued in that case as well. It was cutting programs that are widespread. And of course, my office has 2 very important federal programs that are granted and would have, ostensibly been impacted. They're related to public safety. So it wasn't just programs that I think people would have imagined would be impacted like social programs. It was also programs that impacted our public safety. I'm talking specifically in my office about the public safety around child sexual assault of children, as well as around Medicaid fraud, which can look like abuse for the disabled and elderly folks in Vermont. So very important grants. We sued and prevailed there with a preliminary injunction. The third case was, and I'm just going to breeze through these. I know we have questions later and we can dig in a little bit deeper. The third case was a case regarding the Treasury Department. Recall that and it all moves so fast. I'm sure that you remember some of these, but the Treasury Department case involved access to our personal data by folks as a part of the DOJ, the so-called DOJ, and our personal data, we know from our office, can be used to nefarious ends by scammers. So keeping our data private, making sure that the data is only accessed by those who have been vetted and who are appropriate to view that data is critical. Data privacy is something that's been important to me for a long time. So I immediately wanted to get involved with this issue as well. And once again, the court issued an injunction blocking the Treasury Department from allowing that access. So that was the third week. The fourth week, and this one was significant. This was an executive order, I think it was an executive order, that involved the National Institutes of Health, the NIH. The University of Vermont, of course, is not only our university, but a major research university, and they received millions of dollars in NIH grants that would have been impacted. We were happy to get involved to try to restore those grants. And I'm happy to say that we have a nationwide injunction in place. Just to, kind of round that out a little bit, the NIH grants aren't just grants the impact, I should say, isn't just the grant that provides the funding to do that critical medical research. It also motivates and encourages an economy around that money. So, professionals moving to Vermont, once they move to Vermont, what are they doing? They're going to the grocery store and making purchases. Their kids are in schools, they're a part of the community. So, that money, which is our tax dollars, our federal tax dollars coming back to our state, was critical for reasons other than just the immediate, obvious research grants that were being done. So I'm proud that we were able to get involved with that case. The fifth case related to Elon Musk specifically and Doge. Elon Musk was not properly vetted, and he did not go through the Senate confirmation process as he should have been. One of the challenges that we have had with wrapping our arms around that case is that the facts keep changing. In court, lawyers will say, oh, Elon Musk isn't in charge. And then Elon Musk goes on his social media platform X and says that he is in charge and he's doing all of these things. So we are continuing to gather resource information in that case so that we can move ahead, if appropriate, with a motion for a preliminary injunction once we have the facts gathered about what is actually happening with Elon Musk and Doge. The sixth case, are you getting tired yet? I'm getting a little weary myself. The sixth case is related to the mass firing of federal employees. There is a process that needs to be followed when you mass fire federal employees, and that process was not followed. This was seems like just a few days ago. And one thing that I find to be so insidious is the mass firings were on false pretenses to begin with. They said that people were being fired for performance issues when, you've probably all heard this, but the folks being fired have evidence of their glowing performance review. And what happens when someone has a negative performance review or negative, they're fired because of supposedly performance issues, makes it difficult to get another job in government because you have this black mark on your record that's totally false and unjustified. So that one is just particularly cruel. I'm happy that we were able to get involved with that one. And critically, we have an injunction in place for 18 federal agencies. So we're looking forward to getting an update on that this evening, actually at 7. The federal government has to give us an update. Okay, last one. I know this is a lot. The last one relates to the Department of Education. Our friends in the Trump administration are trying to eliminate the Department of Education. This has not been a secret. We've been hearing about that from the president himself. And so what they did is they fired half the workforce at the Department of Education. The Department of Education is critical for Vermonters who are disabled, for people in rural areas generally. They have the Office of Civil Rights that helps protect against harassment. And of course, the folks who are applying for financial aid. So they play a really critical role. In Vermont, we're so familiar with our own state and local space of education because we have a system where we're very familiar with our school boards and everything. But the National Department of Education plays a critical role. Donald Trump cannot just eliminate the Department of Education. Critically, you will see a thread through all of these and the justifications of our lawsuit, and it's this. The president violated the Constitution and he violated federal law. One of the ways that he is repeatedly violating the Constitution is by trying to do the job that the Constitution has given to the legislative branch. As Representative James and I see Rob Hunter is on here as well. As they well know, it's the legislative branch that gets to spend our money. It isn't the executive branch, the president. So the president can't just decide to undo what Congress has already decided to do. So it's very important that we hold the administration to account when they do that. We have to stick up for our system of government. And that's what we're doing when we bring these lawsuits. We have been working night and day around the clock, monitoring these cases, working with our fellow state attorneys general in other states on these, and trying to not just advance where Vermont's values are, but also preserving our democracy, our 3 branches of government, Vermont as a sovereign state, all of these critical things that we all learned in school and I learned in Manchester, we are trying to advance that and preserve it so that we will, at the end of this administration, still have the American democracy, American federalism, and American rule of law that we all know and love.
Thank you, Attorney General Clark. Treasurer Pieciak, could I get you perhaps to just give us sort of an overview of where your office has been exerting its attention?
Yeah, thank you, Paige, and thank you very much to Representative James and Representative Hunter, who I saw on the screen here a minute ago. There he is, for inviting us here to speak with you all, and nice to see you as well, Alexandra. I hope everything is well in Manchester. Thank you for having Charity and myself be able to speak with you this evening. You know, we had a couple of in-person town halls this weekend, and first thing I asked people, or the first thing we talked about, was whether folks had been experiencing more anger, fear, and anxiety over the last few months compared to the last few years. And every single hand in the audience went up. And I think those three emotions are important just to focus on because they're very powerful emotions: fear, anger, anxiety. They're powerful because they impact us. They can keep us up at night. They can physically impact us, make our heart race, cloud our judgment. But I think the thing that they can do that's the most destructive at this point in time is they can make us retreat. They can make us isolate from each other. They are emotions that make us go into our corner. But the antidote to that, the antidote to those emotions, is bringing people together into community like we're doing this evening on this town hall. You know, when we get together and realize our fears are shared among our community members, when we realize our anger can be put into something that is productive, when we realize anxiety will lose its grip when we come together and feel safe with each other, that is very powerful in and of itself. So want to appreciate those that put this town hall together in Manchester. I think continuing to have events like this, continuing to be together, find community, build community, is going to be really critical to us getting through the next few years. In terms of our office, you know, looking back to the first Trump administration, I was the commissioner at the Department of Financial Regulation. And I found that when we were proactive and we were coordinated, that we were able to get ahead of some of these fast moving federal policies. And sometimes when we weren't as coordinated and we weren't as proactive, there were things that changed at the national level, at the federal level, that sort of put us on our heels, and we were responding to them in ways where we didn't have all the information, or we didn't know who to contact. We didn't know what to do. So I think it was critical going into this administration that we try to find a way to convene a group of leaders in a proactive, coordinated way. That's why we established something called the Transition Task Force out of our office. That was a way for us to get leaders that are focused on the economy, on the state's budget, on revenues, on things that impact our office and things that impact, you know, Vermonters at the kitchen table, and get some expertise on how are these things going to impact us? Who should we be advocating to? Whose stories should we be lifting up and telling, both to local leaders and to federal leaders? And then what policies should we be thinking about at the state level as well, and responding to these actions at the federal level? And the four things that really sort of, a lot of things concern me about the Trump administration, but the four things that we're really focused on in terms of the impact on Vermont and the economy, there's sort of four numbers that I think tell the story. One is 36%. And 36% is the percentage of federal funding we receive from the federal government to support our state budget. The vast majority of that is Medicaid. It makes up the vast majority of those funds. But there are all the other departments that heavily rely on federal funding, like Charity pointed out, the Agency of Education, the Department of Labor. They administer critical programs for Vermonters. So 36% of our state budget is from the federal government, making us highly dependent on the federal government. 67%, that's the other figure, 67% of our goods imported into Vermont from international markets come from Canada. Canada is our largest trading partner. So that, with the discussion of tariffs being implemented and then withdrawn and implemented and withdrawn, it really makes me concerned about what that means for tourism and trade with one of our most longstanding allies. 67% of trade of import comes in from Canada for Vermont. And on top of that, hundreds of thousands of Canadians visit Vermont every year, spending over $150 million into our economy. So I worry about what the economic impact is of that. And if you think about it more broadly, just the uncertainty that has come with this trade war, not just on Canada, but Mexico and China and more broadly across the globe, it's brought uncertainty into our economy and into our markets. And we're seeing the result of that in terms of the stock market, in terms of consumer confidence and retail purchasing. We're seeing that in terms of projection of the GDP growth for next quarter. And all of that signals that the economy is not nearly as strong as it was just a few months ago. And nothing really fundamentally has changed other than this uncertainty that's been injected into it. So in that way, it's really self-induced, and it could have serious results for Vermont and more broadly the United States. So the other number that we think about is 1 in 5. 1 in 5 Vermonters are employed by a nonprofit. So nonprofits are a critical part of our economy. They contribute billions of dollars of economic activity into Vermont. And with 1 in 5 Vermonters being employed by a nonprofit, and a lot of the federal funding that goes to these nonprofits being put at jeopardy, either from illegal action or legal action, puts a lot of those jobs and a lot of the good work that those organizations are doing at risk. And then the last thing is thinking about where Vermont stands relative to all the other states when it comes to things like FEMA reimbursement in particular. So we're 5th in the country over the last 5 years in terms of the per capita amount of federal assistance that's come to Vermont as a result of a major disaster declaration for a natural disaster. 5th per capita in terms of the amount of money that's come to our state to help us rebuild after a natural disaster. That's one area in particular that gives us concern because it's an area that we're highly dependent on the federal government and where the federal government has a lot of discretion about whether or not to declare a state of emergency. So those are just 4 things that, I think tell the story about why we're so concerned and focused about the impact of these federal actions will have on the Vermont economy. A lot of other states are in very similar position, as is Vermont. But I think in some ways we're a little bit more vulnerable because we are highly dependent on the federal government, both in terms of our budget and in terms of some of the aspects of our economy. We're highly dependent on trade from one of the countries that's in the crosshairs of this trade war. And we're highly dependent because, unfortunately, of the increased natural disasters that we've seen over the last few years and last decade, really, here in Vermont. So this task force that we have is continuing to sort of advocate at the state and national level about some of these impacts we're seeing in Vermont. We're trying to push out information to the business community and to the nonprofit community. We had a couple of webinars earlier this month on doing business in uncertain times, which was a very timely topic. A couple of weeks before that, we had a webinar about what to do if ICE comes to your workplace. What are your rights and responsibilities as an employer? That had a really, really well attended, and somebody from Charity's office participated in that. We appreciate that very much. And then we think about policies that we can consider at the state level to respond to some of these changes at the federal level. I think one that is probably most important for us to think about is the creation of a reserve fund that would be dedicated for natural disasters, responding to natural disasters, both in terms of monies that we might need to make sure we're pulling down all the federal money we can, but also in the event that the federal government's not as consistent or is not there for us in the future, making sure we have funds available to get us back on our feet. So happy to answer any questions that you might have, but this gives a little bit of an overview of our work to date and sort of the areas of focus for our office.
No, thank you for that. And I appreciate the overview from both the Attorney General and the Treasurer's Office. We've had a bunch of community members who submitted questions in advance in order to be able to help shape the evening's conversation. So I think I'm going to start with those questions. But just to reiterate, a lot of people also submitted questions that are specifically about the Vermont legislature and tax policies, but because of time constraints, we're really only going to be addressing questions germane to the stated topic of this evening, which is how Vermont is responding to the new federal administration. So if there are other questions that are not related to that direct topic for this evening, I do recommend, and I would direct people towards Representatives James and Hunter for those more direct questions. The first question I'd like to start with, Charity, if you don't mind, you hit on this earlier in your introduction, but I think that this is definitely worth going back to. Um, it's going to touches on a lot of the other topics we're going to be speaking about. Can you explain how the power of the purse works in the federal government? Where does that power reside? Is it with the executive branch? Is it with the legislative branch? Can you address that, please?
Sure. And just to like take us all the way back, one of the reasons why we have these three branches of government is to prevent a king basically from taking over the country, right? Our founding fathers were very sensitive about the idea of a king. And so we have these checks and balances on each other. Part of that involved the certain branches getting assigned certain responsibilities. And Congress itself, I would argue, because it's not one person, it's all of these people having to collaborate and work together, is very effective in itself at resulting in some sort of checks and balances because it's not just one person. So our system assigns the power of the purse to Congress, to the legislative branch, and they are responsible for spending our money. I am sure it's very frustrating to be in the executive branch. I'm sure our own governor sometimes gets frustrated and wish he could just like write the budget and be done with it instead of having to pitch it to the legislature and persuade them to see things his way. But the truth is that system that we put in place protects one person from becoming too powerful. And I think the unfortunate truth here is that we have a president who wishes to be more powerful, and which is why you see so many of the actions he's taking. Really, that is the common thread among his executive orders, among the actions he's taking, is a wish to be more powerful. He is consistently trying to do away with expenditures that Congress has made. Part of that is literal, like transforming offices to be something other than they were supposed to be, firing people to gut an agency that has been funded by the Congress, or with these grants, like specifically do away with grants that Congress has decided should be made. And so anyway, that's kind of a long answer. I'm sort of a nerd about this stuff, but ultimately it is absolutely the legislative branch that is responsible for spending the taxpayers' money.
If I can just kind of carry on that thread for just a moment. So you had a lawsuit, you just mentioned this as well, regarding the mass firing of federal employees. And a federal judge recently ordered that these employees must be reinstated. So what happens next? Where does that go?
So if I can explain this a little too, another thread that we will see through some of these actions that we sued over are that there are systems in place, steps that need to be taken to do whatever the Trump administration wants to do. We saw this last time too, especially with environmental issues. There are certain ways that the administration is supposed to conduct business, and that it might take time. It might have steps that the Trump administration is like, we don't want to bother with that. And so they violated the laws that put those in place and tried to do things their own way. This is an example of that. If you want to have a mass firing of staff, there's a certain way you have to go about doing it. And they didn't provide notice. They didn't do the things you're supposed to do. They're just trying to be like quick about it and do it their way. The problem, ironically, is that it is very inefficient to do it the way that they're doing it. It's costing all the, people who are suing. I think Donald Trump has been sued, or his administration, 100 times. Think about all the judiciary time that's being spent on these. So it is not an efficient way of doing things. And it's honestly, it's very disappointing and a shame, because there are real problems that we are facing in Vermont and across this country, and they're not being addressed. Instead, new problems are being created by these unconstitutional and illegal actions. Paige, I admit somewhat lost track of the exact question you asked. I know I answered some of it, but what was the exact question you asked?
The question that I'm asking is kind of more procedural than anything else. So what is the next step, right? So if the judge has now ordered that the employees must be reinstated, who enforces that?
This is
How does that get enforced?
This is an exciting moment because it actually is today at 7. The federal government is supposed to make a report to the judge to say, here's how we're doing how with the reinstatement. So we are waiting until 7 to find out what happens. So that'll be an exciting moment. I know there might be embedded in your question the question that's on a lot of people's minds, which is, what if the federal government ignores the court? Then what happens? Well, we would, of course, have a constitutional crisis at some point where the executive branch is ignoring the judicial branch. But what I can point out is that the Trump administration is made up of people, and the people handling these lawsuits are lawyers, and lawyers need to be held accountable when they violate their ethical responsibilities. And so we have to keep that in mind. I mean, I think that it is unnerving to think we have a president who so flagrantly violates the law and the Constitution. But ultimately, the Trump administration is made up of lawyers. And what we have seen so far is they actually are complying by and large with the judicial decisions that are contrary to their wishes. So we hope that continues going forward. And obviously, this is top of mind every day, and we're monitoring closely all of those.
Thank you. I'm just going to shift directions here a little bit so that I can speak to Treasurer Pieciak here. You mentioned in your opening commentary about the tariffs on Mexican and Canadian goods. And I'm wondering if you can maybe address with a little bit more detail how the tariffs on those goods will affect Vermont businesses, but also what small business owners can do in order to be able to protect themselves from these risks.
Yeah, it's a great question, Paige. You know, I mentioned how Canada is their number one trading partner. Mexico's number 2 for Vermont. So we have, in terms of imports, so we have quite a bit of exposure, as do most American states, honestly, between both of those trading markets, Mexico and Canada. In terms of small business, I mean, it's one of the reasons we were so concerned about the tariffs is, small businesses are often in a worse position to absorb the impact of a trade war, because the first thing that happens is costs go up. You pay more for what the tariff is, in this case 25%. So all of a sudden, you as the wholesaler, as the importer, as the person that's going to be selling to retail customers, your price went up 25%. Now if you're a small business, you're not necessarily in a position to absorb that entire 25%. You have to pass it along to your customers. So all of a sudden, your customers are paying more for your product. If you're a larger business, you might be able to absorb all of that cost or some of that cost for a period of time, so you can have a more competitively priced product in the marketplace. So it puts more pressure on our small businesses. It's another reason, not just because we have so much trade with Canada, but because we have so many small businesses in Vermont that we're concerned about this. And then the other one is, if you're a larger business, you probably have a more diversified supply chain, or you can more quickly get a diversified supply chain, potentially from a country where a tariff is not imposed. If you're a smaller business, your supply chain is more likely than not just a single entity or two that are providing you whatever it is that you need to operate your business. And you're not in a position to as quickly find that same product from a country that doesn't have a tariff applied to it. So that's a real concern for us in Vermont, and that impact that it has on our business community. In terms of, what the impact is more broadly, generally in this kind of situation, you're going to see prices go up. It's sort of a bad thing for the consumer. Prices are going to go up. You're going to pay more. It has an inflationary impact. Now, if you wanted to say what's the benefit of imposing these tariffs, you would say, well, if there are tariffs imposed and there are products that individual manufacturers could make in the United States rather than Canada or Mexico, then maybe they'll look to import, repatriatize some of that manufacturing into the United States, into Vermont, and that will be good long term for the economy. Now, the reason I say that's sort of the potential economic benefit is because in light of the way that these tariffs have been applied and then adjusted and taken off and then kicked down the road, it's not a consistent, cohesive trading agenda that would give any manufacturer confidence that it's going to exist in a permanent way for long enough for them to make those important investments to bring manufacturing back to the United States. So basically, in that sense, in my opinion, we're getting the worst of both cases. We're getting only the downside negative in terms of higher prices for individuals and consumers, and we're not getting any of the possible upside in terms of re-domestication of manufacturing that might be happening outside the United States. Because the trade policy is so inconsistent, it's nothing that a business can rely on to make those kind of long-term investments. So it's had a destabilizing impact. You see it in the way that the economy is responding in the last 3 or 4 weeks. It has a destabilizing impact in terms of the relationship between these countries. We're seeing it here in northern Vermont. We had visits to a couple of businesses in the Northeast Kingdom who talked about that they have very high visitation from Quebec, and they're already getting phone calls from their longtime customers saying, we're not going to be coming this summer to Vermont. We'll see you in 4 years. We'll see you when there's a change in policy. We'll see you when there's a new president. And that, on top of the trade, can have a significant economic impact to our state.
So to piggyback on that again, I mean, is there anything that you can recommend to small businesses? How do they handle protecting themselves from this kind of risk? What is the way to be able to plan long term if there is this vacillating back and forth, tariffs on, tariffs off? How to move forward?
Yeah, I mean, some of it, unfortunately, is sort of what's leading to the economic uncertainty. Is you want to sort of pull back and maintain your cash, and you want to think about how you want to have conversations with your local bank, and you want to say, can I get a line of credit? Can I get some flexibility so that I have room to maneuver? But that means that that's cash that's being put on the sideline instead of into our economy, which is not, where you want to see that long term. I say it's harder for a small business to find products that potentially come from countries that don't have the tariffs being applied. But that's also a possibility, is evaluating your supply chain and seeing what other parts of that those products could come from other than potentially Canada or Mexico. Another thing that traditionally happens, but it seems like it's not going to happen now, is asking for exemptions. So industries will ask for exemptions from the tariffs. This happened in the past when Trump had tariffs on aluminum and steel, but there were a lot of exemptions to those tariffs so that certain steel that was required for important construction projects and housing projects and the like could be imported without tariffs. But to date, there's been no exemptions issued, and there's been affirmative statements that there will be no exemptions issued. So that sort of puts businesses in a hard spot to sort of apply for those kind of industry-wide exemptions, which are usual. So really the advice is to hunker down a bit, try to build in flexibility into your business operations so that you have the ability to pivot. That's not great when every business does that. It's not great for the overall economy, but it really is the way that a business needs to operate in these uncertain times.
Thank you for that. I appreciate you offering possible means forward as well as just kind of analyzing the situation. Speaking, however, of, going back to this kind of tangentially banking related, Charity, your office has joined in on a lawsuit regarding Doge's access to the Treasury Department. So the data that has been accessed, right? So a federal judge granted a preliminary injunction and directed Doge individuals to, and I'm quoting here, immediately destroy any and all copies of materials downloaded from the Treasury Department's records and systems, end quote. So my question is, and I guess I keep going back to this, how is this going to be enforced? How do you ensure that the sensitive information that has been breached, how do we guarantee that that actually gets recovered? How do people know that their information is safe?
So, what happens, this is very common in the legal world, is there is an element of reassurance by the lawyers that we are, our opponent lawyers. And that is the case here. We've been reassured that these steps are being taken, and we do typically rely on that representation by an opposing counsel. And if we have any reason to believe that the government is actually not complying, then we can take the steps to go back to court. And that's the approach that we're taking now with this particular case to that relates to our data privacy.
I'm sorry. So can you reiterate for me? So the approaches that you're taking is that we're relying on the information coming from opposing counsel, or that
It's the assurances that they're making to us. I mean, so, remember, lawyers are bound by ethical rules. And so you can't perpetrate a fraud on the court. If you tell the court we're complying, you have to comply. And so that is the posture that we have now. And if we have any indication that that's not happening, we will take steps. And in fact, previously we have taken steps when we have felt that an order is not being complied with, and we can move to enforce the order, and the judge has, a few opportunities to get the person who's failing to comply with their order in line. But so far, that isn't the case. That hasn't been found in this particular case.
All right, thank you for that. Treasurer Pieciak, I'm going to come back to you for a moment. This is something you also alluded to in your opening statements. Federal funds make up about a third of our state's budget. So you did suggest possible movements forward, but how can the state prepare for the loss of federal funding?
Yeah, so I think there's two buckets that we want to be thinking about in this regard. One is something that Charity alluded to earlier about the federal government stopping funding from coming to the state of Vermont, or freezing funding or reappropriating funding on their own. So basically, all of that boils down to illegal, potentially unconstitutional actions by the federal government. So those are matters of sort of temporary, impairment in terms of that money coming to the state of Vermont, or to a organization that the state of Vermont has designated to do work on its behalf. There might be a lawsuit that's required. There might be a judicial order that's required to get those funds flowing again. So that's something of a temporary, that's a temporary nature. So if that happened to the state of Vermont, we would have funds to be able to work our way through a temporary interruption of federal funds. We, as a state of Vermont, have a significant amount of cash on hand that's waiting to be spent. It's monies that have been appropriated but not yet spent, basically our checking account, if you will, or our savings account. So we have over $1.7 billion in our cash on hand that we are holding at the treasurer's office. So if you're talking about those temporary delays and disruptions, there's the ability to move through that. But the thing that's more concerning is when, through a legal means, so through congressional action, and then by signing of the president into law, a budget that cuts or reduces state aid to Vermont or any other state, there's not a legal recourse. It's a political action that they've taken, and a legitimate one, that cuts our funding. And that's what has happened with the bill, the budget that's been proposed by House Republicans and passed by the House into the Senate. And the most significant cut in that budget was $880 billion for Medicaid. When you look at what that means for Vermont, over the next 10 years, it would be about $2 billion in cuts for the state. It would impact about 20,000 people that are on Medicaid currently. Now, one thing the Republican Congress did not do is specify what exactly those cuts would mean in terms of the Medicaid cuts. They just came up with a big number and said, this is what we want the cuts to be. So we're kind of left scrambling to figure out what would be the most likely thing to be cut, so we can understand what the impact would be. We think it's probably Medicaid expansion that Vermont has decided to do, and a number of other states have, that expanded eligibility for Medicaid. There are tens of thousands of Vermonters that take advantage of that Medicaid expansion. It's 90% paid for by the federal government. The state of Vermont has to put in 10% of those costs. So if that went away, that would mean, again, 17,000, 20,000 people would not have insurance that they have today. There could potentially be work requirements that are imposed by the federal government. So not only would the work requirements for many make it more challenging to have their health insurance, but it would be something that the state of Vermont would have to administer. So it's additional cost to the state of Vermont in terms of hiring the personnel and setting up that program, which adds to our budget impact as well. So you've heard a lot of other governors talk about this when they ask, how do you backfill that amount of money? The simple answer is we can't. Other states have expressed the same opinion that it's not really feasible to backfill all of those cuts that might be coming from the federal government if done through the legal manner. So it's why it's so important to engage in the political process as they're developing and looking to pass this budget over the next 6 months. If these cuts do come down the pike, it will mean the loss of critical services for not just Vermonters, but as we pointed out when we were down in Washington, D.C. last week, Vermont, 22% of our population is on Medicaid. We are a state that voted in some of the highest numbers for Kamala Harris, but a state that voted in some of the highest numbers for Donald Trump, West Virginia, has 28% of its population on Medicaid. So the thing that the Congress has taken the biggest bullseye to, Medicaid, it is not a red or a blue state issue. It's an issue that would be impactful across the board. And we're going to need to continue to engage in that political battle to try to get the Republican budget to move away from those kind of cuts. And the last point I'll make is when you think about why are they cutting $880 billion from Medicaid, it's not like we are battling a pandemic or facing the great financial crisis we did in 2008, or we're trying to fight a world war. It's simply to provide tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires. So it's not a matter of some great national emergency. It's really a policy choice that the Republicans have taken to take money that's been paid in by ordinary Americans over the years through tax dollars, through specific payments into systems, and take that for the purpose of providing significant tax cuts. So again, I think the CR is in place now that extends this budget discussion for a few more months, but it's going to be critical that not just those of us that live in democratic states, but constituents and stakeholders in all of the states that would be impacted, red and blue alike, make sure their voices are heard to their elected representatives in Congress.
Thank you for that. Switching back, Charity, to you, I had asked you about Doge in my last question, and just to kind of a little preamble on this one, you were signed on to a lawsuit that was challenging the power delegated to Elon Musk. My understanding is that the judge declined a temporary restraining order in that it was not directly impacting Vermont, right? You need to demonstrate that there is a harm done to the state of Vermont for you to be able to sign on to it. So what happens now in that case?
We were able to sign on to the lawsuit. It was the temporary restraining order phase that the court was not inclined to grant. And that's just there's immediate harm right now. You have to do something, even though we haven't even done much other than this piece of paper, this brief. There hasn't been an evidentiary proceeding. There's not discovery. Discovery is when you swap documents and depose each other and witnesses and stuff like that. And so right now, that's what we're doing. We're doing discovery. So we're gathering information about what is Elon Musk doing? What's the situation here? What could the harm potentially be to Vermont? We're trying to understand it. And then if we gather that information and conclude, well, here we are, we do have harm and we understand better what the system looks like. So that process is ongoing. I should say we are approaching this case and all of the cases I mentioned with a sense of urgency, because what we have seen is that the Trump administration is trying to move very quickly in the ask for forgiveness, not for permission. I actually do think they're going to skip their forgiveness portion too, but that's kind of been their MO. And so we also are trying to move quickly so that we can stop the harm from happening as quickly as possible. But this one required us to gather more information.
I do want to address a question that came up in the chat, and it kind of goes along with the idea of that the harm needs to be demonstrated harm to Vermont. Does your office have, I guess, in the works, any cases that are directed towards the DEI initiatives, the DEI executive orders that have come down?
Well, I love the opportunity to talk about DEI. Something that I have found from my friends who are supportive of Donald Trump is that they didn't realize that it is currently illegal to discriminate against anyone, and that includes white men. You can't hire someone who's not a white man just because that person is a white man. That's also illegal. So DEI is not at all illegal. DEI is a way of saying we don't want anybody to experience bias. So we want to have an equal playing field so that, for example, the best person gets the job. So that's all DEI is. And I think it's been sort of vilified for convenience by certain Republicans. And it has sort of morphed in the imagination of people who aren't following it closely into something that it isn't. So addressing that right away. And I want to flag this, my office and other state attorneys general provided a guidance to businesses and entities about DEI programs, and you can find that on our website. I just want to make sure that people know it's available because this is kind of like a scary and confusing time. So generally, I can say about this and all measures that the Trump administration is taking, we are carefully analyzing literally every single one. And if you think we missed one that's not an executive order, those are easy to find. Please let us know. We are literally analyzing every one for two things. As I mentioned before, we want to see if the federal statute or the Constitution is being violated. But secondly, is Vermont the correct party to sue? That is called standing. Only a person, and there's certain criteria you have to meet, can sue. So, if your neighbor is the one who's hit by the car and you weren't harmed at all, well, you aren't the one to bring the lawsuit. You don't have standing. So that's an example. And so we need to make sure that Vermont has standing, even if there is a harm. Are we the right, correct party that's allowed to bring a lawsuit? So that's what we're looking at with all of these actions. I mean, sadly, our fear is being realized. Based on the first Trump administration, we saw repeated violations of the Constitution and federal law. We had to sue 62 times. We prevailed in some fashion or another 60 times. And we had a preview with Project 2025 about what was in store for the country if Trump was elected. That was helpful to us because we could prepare based on Project 2025. And unfortunately, having to sue the president once a week is not conducive to making America great again, if you will. And it certainly has taken up a lot of judicial resources as well as staff resources for my office. So there we have it.
Thank you. I appreciate you addressing the question that was coming from the chat. I want to go back to Mike. I have a question for you here. You had mentioned up in the north that businesses have been seeing the typical Canadian, I guess, migration for vacation and whatnot has taken an impact. So I guess if you could just address for me, how important is Canadian tourism to the Vermont economy? So, I mean, I don't know that. I mean, down the southern end of the state, I don't know that we necessarily have a real good view of that.
Yeah. So when you look at, the Department of Tourism just put out a new report that looks at the impact of tourism in Vermont. So, we get millions of visitors a year in Vermont. I think the estimate was about 700,000 individual visits come from Canadians, and $150 million of economic activity is brought in by those visits into our state. So those are felt, broadly in Vermont. But if you think about some of the places that Canadians and particularly folks from Quebec visit more regularly, that means Church Street in the summertime. That means Jay Peak in the wintertime. Jay Peak has a significant percentage of its visitors from Quebec. So I think there's going to be disproportionate impact across Vermont, but certainly those 700,000 plus Canadian visits on an annual basis touch pretty much every community in our state.
Thank you. And then connected to our challenges with Canada, I mean, Vermont gets about 25% of its power from across the border, correct?
Yeah,
can you
that
speak a
that
little
is
bit
right.
to how the tariffs then impact that?
Yeah, so that is absolutely right. I mean, when we're thinking about that impact to everyday Vermonters, it is one of the biggest impacts is that energy cost. As you point out, 25% of our electricity comes from Hydro-Quebec. So Vermont's in a long-term contract with Hydro-Quebec that runs till 2035, and some of the question will be, well, first of all, there'll be a question about, and I think it's an open question. I mean, just like all of these actions that have been taken, there's so much action and then not a lot of forethought. So the simple action of how do you tariff an electron that's sort of moving through the grid between Canada and the United States is sort of an open one that I don't think has been resolved. So I think mechanically there's a question of how do you tariff electricity that's flowing from Hydro-Quebec into the United States, into the Vermont grid. But then if we move past that, 30% of our gasoline, our diesel, kerosene comes from Canada as well. So we might be able to find new suppliers for gasoline and the like. But if not, those would see an increase in price. But it's pretty much impossible for us to get to a place where we're not reliant on Hydro-Quebec for electricity, at least to a significant degree. So we would see potentially price increases. Now, in that contract that we have with Hydro-Quebec are certain minimum and maximum price guarantees. So if the tariffs mean that we'll go through the top end of that price guarantee, you could see litigation ensuing from that as well. So I think just like with everything with tariffs, I think the word to summarize it is uncertainty in terms of how that will all play out. But the bottom line, if it does play out and they do operationalize it, it's higher cost for consumers and higher cost for Vermonters.
Just to I guess this is a question that could go, Charity, Mike, to either way on you. I mean, because this is, I know, Charity, your office has done quite a bit looking at immigration. And Mike, I think that since we have immigration challenges taking place right now, it's important to kind of look at what Vermont industries actually sort of rely on workers from, outside of the United States. So I was wondering if you might be able to, each of you maybe, since we're running out of time, maybe kind of just sort of touch on where we stand currently with the challenges to immigration here into Vermont and the country. We'll say, Charity, if you don't mind, maybe start with you.
Sure. Our office intersects in this issue in a few ways. The first is that we are constitutional experts, so we always try to show up in this space. We also are intimately involved by statute in the fair and impartial policing policy, which says that basically it's important everyone realize public safety is the priority of our law enforcement here in Vermont. The federal government is in charge of immigration. That's not what we do. We cannot be conscripted into helping them with their job because we have a very important job here in Vermont, and that's ensuring public safety. So we have a fair and impartial policing policy that is put in statute, and it requires local law enforcement to have a policy in place, and we have a form, that they can follow, or they can amend it a little bit, but it needs to follow at the minimum, be as protective as the statewide model. And it says that we're not going to cooperate on immigration issues. That is not the job of local law enforcement. The second area where we is worth touching on is we have a civil rights unit. The civil rights unit, despite a broad and lofty name, is actually really focused on employment discrimination. And we do not ask when people come to us about their issue with employment discrimination. That is not an issue that we delve into their immigration status. We're focused on the protected classes that are appropriate for an analysis of whether or not there's been discrimination. So those are the areas in which our office kind of intersects with the immigration space, and acknowledging, because we're in a rush, but I still want to say, our new Americans, immigrants play a critical part of our economy, our food, everything here in Vermont. And Mike probably will touch on this, but I think people don't realize enough that we used to have a perfect bond rating. Our financial situation was the sunniest it could be here in Vermont. And the reason why we lost it was because we're not replacing ourselves. More people are dying than being born. And we rely on people coming into this state to help us keep our population up and stability of our finances. And our governor even always is saying, I want more refugees to come to settle here in Vermont so that we can make sure our population stays up. So that's always an important part of the conversation in my mind when we talk about immigration.
Mike, can you touch on this one for us?
Yeah, happy to. So, as Charity references, new Americans, immigrants have always played a key role in the Vermont economy and will continue to play a key role going forward in the Vermont economy. From the broadest standpoint, when you look at migration patterns in Vermont, we have seen our population tick up during and following the pandemic, but it's largely high income earners. So it's high income earners that have come to Vermont with their job that's probably remote. Maybe they moved into their second home. Maybe they bought a home. It's put a lot of pressure on our housing market. It's put a lot of pressure for first-time home buyers and the like. It's meant we had a lot more tax revenue. We've seen our tax revenue go up, but it's put a lot of pressure on our workforce, particularly the workers that earn their living from Vermont. They're not a second income, or they're not a remote income earner. So another place where we have not seen the population keep up is with those workforce type jobs in that population. We saw high income earners increase, but we've seen low income earners decrease in Vermont. So if we're going to find the workforce that we need to handle all of those critical jobs like firefighters and nurses and teachers, we're going to need to rely on new Americans to fill many of those jobs. Right now, new Americans play a critical role in agriculture. They play a critical role in our hospitality sector. And if you've ever visited a manufacturer in Chittenden County, I think you'll be surprised how many of our manufacturers are so heavily dependent on new Americans to make sure their factories are working and their product is getting completed and shipped out. So they play a critical role in our economy. It's why myself and our task force both have advocated for and are supporting the creation of something called the Office of New Americans, which would help recruit and retain new Americans into Vermont. There are other states that have implemented a similar office, including Maine. I think Maine is a little bit ahead of the curve as it relates to us and attempting to recruit and retain new Americans. I think we need to catch up because they do play and will play a critical role in our economy going forward.
I thank you both. I know for a fact that there are probably at least a dozen more questions that could be asked, but we have come to the end of our allotted time. So thank you, Attorney General Clark. Thank you, Secretary Treasurer Pieciak. Thank you, Representatives James and Hunter, for being here and for giving us this opportunity to be able to have our town hall.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.